Imagine walking into a dimly lit kitchen in Georgia. The year is 1852. The air is thick with the smell of iron, not from rusted tools or farm equipment, but from something far more unsettling. On the oak table rests a silver decanter, filled not with wine but with blood. A young maid named Clara is seen pouring it into crystal glasses, her face calm, almost ritualistic, as if she knows this is no accident, no madness, but something planned, something ordained. Hours later, the family she served lay convulsing on the floor, their veins blackened, their tongues swollen, their eyes wide open as if staring into a void they never thought existed. The official records call it sudden fever. The whispers, however, call it the supper of blood. And Clara, the kitchen maid, vanished that very night. Her name struck from the household registry, her story buried beneath the polite lies of history. But history has cracks, and through those cracks, the truth bleeds. What happened in that house was no random act of madness, no servant's rebellion. It was a mirror, a revelation of the kind of corruption that runs through the veins of powerful families, a corruption so deep that even their food and drink became poisoned with it. Clara was no ordinary maid. She was born into chains, raised in silence, and used as a tool in a house that believed bloodlines made gods of men. But she learned early that the blood of masters is not sacred, and she proved it in the most unforgettable way. You see, the history you were taught is an illusion, carefully edited by institutions that thrive on keeping you obedient. They feed you stories of noble families, moral leaders, clean traditions. Yet behind every polished silver spoon, there was someone like Clara, invisible, erased, silenced. And when the silence breaks, when the invisible dares to strike, history itself trembles. Tonight I'm going to take you into that kitchen, not just to relive the horror of blood instead of wine, but to uncover why this story was hidden, who made sure it stayed hidden, and what it reveals about the systems that still control you today. Stay with me, because once you step inside, you'll never look at a dinner table the same way again. Georgia in 1852 was a theater of wealth and brutality, where plantations rose like fortresses of pride, built on the backs of enslaved bodies and maintained through silence, fear, and ritual. The house where Clara worked was no exception. It belonged to the Harlan family, an old southern dynasty who traced their lineage back to the first English settlers. They prided themselves on refinement, grand feasts, imported wines, French crystal, and their Sunday suppers, where guests whispered of politics, cotton, and the future of the Confederacy. But beneath the chandeliers and silverware, the foundation was rot. Cruelty disguised as order, domination dressed as civility. Clara, barely 17, was the one who prepared their meals. She rose before dawn, worked until the moon was high, and was never permitted to taste a bite of what she served. She learned to cook by scent alone, her hands mastering every spice, every simmer, every cut of meat until the dishes were flawless. The family praised her skill but despised her existence, treating her not as a human being, but as part of the furniture, a living tool. Yet in silence, Clara observed. She listened. She remembered. And the kitchen became her sanctuary, not of comfort but of knowledge, because knowledge, even in chains, is the first form of rebellion. On the night of the infamous supper, the Harlans' dining room glowed with golden candlelight. Guests arrived in polished carriages, their laughter echoing off marble walls. They expected wine from Bordeaux, rare venison, and sugared fruits shipped from Charleston. What they did not expect was Clara's substitution, a red liquid thicker than any claret, poured into crystal goblets with the same grace she had always shown. No one questioned it. Why would they? They had been conditioned to believe their wealth, their power, their very bloodline protected them from deception, and that arrogance sealed their fate. What followed was chaos. The sound of glasses shattering, bodies seizing, voices screaming as polished civility dissolved into primal terror. And through it all, Clara did not scream. She watched. She waited. And when it was over, she walked away into the night, never to be seen again. The Harlan's official record read, "Mysterious fever." The truth was buried. But ask yourself, why was it buried? Why would the state, the church, and the archives all agree to call this plague when the signs pointed to something else? Because if the story spread, if people learned that even the most powerful families could be undone by a girl they thought powerless, the illusion of control would crack. And control is the only thing the powerful truly fear losing. The archives never mention Clara again. Her name, once scribbled in household ledgers, was struck through in black ink, as if she had never existed. But absence speaks louder than presence. When a story is erased, when a name is forbidden, that is the surest sign that power is at work, shaping what you are allowed to remember and what must be forgotten. So who was Clara? She was born not in Georgia, but in the swamps of South Carolina. Her mother was said to be descended from the Gullah, people who carried fragments of African traditions, languages, and rituals across the Atlantic despite chains and whips. Whispers claim Clara's mother practiced root work, the kind of knowledge plantation owners called superstition, but feared nonetheless. Herbs that could heal, powders that could blind, roots that could poison. That knowledge passed in whispers from mother to daughter, lived inside Clara long before she stepped into the Harlan kitchen. By the time she was 12, Clara had already learned the truth, that the master's world thrived on blood. Not just the blood of crops cut and hands whipped, but the blood of sacrifice. An unspoken cycle where cruelty fed wealth, and wealth demanded more cruelty. She had seen men work to death for a season's profit. She had seen women torn from children to balance a ledger. And she understood something most men never dared to admit. When power feeds on blood, the blood will eventually rise to consume power. The night of the supper was not random. It was calculated. Every drop poured into those glasses was chosen. Some say she slit a hog's throat and mixed its blood with wine. Others whisper darker things, that she took from the overseer who disappeared weeks before, his absence blamed on bandits, though no body was ever found. The records are silent. The truth is blurred. And perhaps that's the point. To keep you guessing, to keep you uncertain. But what is certain is this. Clara turned the master's ritual against them. The dining table, once their altar of control, became their altar of judgment. And in that moment, she reversed the flow of power. She taught a lesson so dangerous that the state of Georgia buried it instantly. That the oppressed are not powerless, that silence is not weakness, and that history itself can be rewritten in blood. The question is not just what Clara did, but who made sure you would never hear her name. Because forgetting Clara serves someone, and that someone still holds the pen that writes your history today. The disappearance of Clara's story was not an accident. It was deliberate, orchestrated by the very pillars of Southern power. You see, a massacre at a dinner table should have been front-page news in 1852. It should have echoed through courtrooms, pulpits, and parlors. But instead, nothing. A few lines in a county ledger, family deceased by sudden fever, household maid missing, that's all. Why? Because the truth threatened the system itself. The plantation order rested on a single myth, that masters were invincible, chosen, and protected by both bloodline and God. The moment Clara turned their own ritual into their undoing, that myth cracked. And cracks spread. The state couldn't afford to let that happen, so the church stepped in first. In the local sermons, preachers spoke of God's mysterious plagues, warning their congregations to remain faithful and obedient. The supper, of blood was rebranded as a divine test, not a human rebellion. The congregation nodded, too afraid to question the man at the pulpit. But behind stained glass windows the whispers spread. Everyone knew what had happened. They just knew, not to say it out loud. Next came the press. Local newspapers already tied to plantation money printed nothing. A few drafts were written, but editors tore them up under pressure from concerned citizens, the polite phrase for men with influence. After all, what would happen if the enslaved across Georgia heard that a 17-year-old maid had brought an entire dynasty to its knees? That story could spread like wildfire, and fire was what the elites feared most. Finally, the state archives. Reports from doctors and witnesses were quietly rewritten, stamped, sealed, and filed under fever. Private notes, the only ones, that mentioned swelling tongues, blackened veins, and goblets filled with something thicker than wine, were locked away or destroyed altogether. The system buried Clara beneath its machinery, grinding her into silence the same way it ground countless others. And yet, despite all their power, the truth survived. Because truth has a strange way of clinging to the cracks of history, whispered from mouth to ear, carried in family stories, hidden in the margins of journals. And if you are hearing this now, it means their silence has failed. Remember this. The same tools that buried Clara's act are still used today. The church still rebrands rebellion as sin. The press still edits reality to fit the comfort of the powerful. And the state still decides what gets remembered and what gets erased. Clara is not just history. Clara is a warning. To understand Clara, you cannot see her as just a kitchen maid. That's how the system wanted you to see her. A shadow in the background, silent, obedient, invisible. But the truth is far more dangerous. Clara was not invisible. She was watching, listening, calculating. Day after day she lived in the Harlan kitchen, serving meals she could never taste, overhearing conversations she was never meant to hear. She knew when creditors pressed too hard, when tempers flared, when the patriarch stumbled back from town with whiskey on his breath. She knew who the mistress feared, which daughter felt trapped, which son played with fire. While the family thought of her as furniture, she had the blueprint of their lives etched into her memory. That knowledge changed her. Imagine the psychological pressure of living in constant silence while knowing the weakness of those who call themselves strong. Imagine biting your tongue for years as you learn every hypocrisy, every cruelty, every fracture beneath the polished silver. That is not servitude. That is training. That is the slow sharpening of a blade. The final edge came when Clara realized a brutal truth. In the world she inhabited, her life would never be hers. She would never walk free, never build a family, never choose her own path. Every sunrise was a repetition of bondage, and in that realization, something shifted. When the future is already stolen, the present becomes a weapon, so she began to prepare. Not loudly, not recklessly, but with precision. She watched which herbs caused sickness, which meats spoiled quickly, which powders burned the tongue. In silence, she built a hidden arsenal of knowledge. And then, when the moment arrived, she struck not out of madness, but mastery. The dining room became her stage, the goblets her instruments, the blood her message. Understand this. Clara's act was not random violence. It was psychological warfare. She targeted not just the flesh of her masters, but their illusion of control. She showed them that even within their fortress, even at their table, even in their moment of pride, they were vulnerable. And nothing terrifies power more than vulnerability. This is why her story was buried, because Clara proved a forbidden truth. When a man or woman strips away fear, They cannot be controlled. She transformed powerlessness into power. And once you see that, once you feel that shift, you can never go back to being obedient again. The Harlan supper was more than a meal. It was a ritual of control. Every Sunday evening, they gathered under chandeliers, sipping wine from imported crystal, dining on dishes served in exact order. The table itself was a stage rehearsed down to the smallest detail. Father at the head, mother opposite, children arranged by age, guests positioned by rank. Even their conversations followed a script: business, politics, propriety. Nothing spontaneous, nothing uncontrolled. This is how power maintains itself, through repetition. The table was not just about food, it was about hierarchy. It reminded every participant of their place. And in that carefully rehearsed ritual, Clara was the unseen priestess. She prepared the courses, polished the silver, poured the drinks. But she was never allowed to partake. She was the silent hand behind the illusion, excluded from it, yet essential to it. That exclusion is the essence of psychological control. Systems condition obedience by keeping you close enough to serve, but never close enough to belong. They feed you scraps while you provide the feast. They let you polish the chalice but forbid you to drink from it. That is how dynasties train submission, through rituals that look harmless, but slowly break the will. Clara shattered that cycle. By replacing wine with blood, she desecrated the ritual itself. She didn't just poison a family, she poisoned the illusion of order. The Sunday supper, once a performance of superiority, became a theater of death. And in that act, Clara revealed something every man listening must understand. Rituals are tools. They are used to bind you, to shape your behavior, to remind you of your place. But rituals can also be broken. And when broken, they lose their power. Ask yourself, what rituals keep you obedient today? The boardroom meetings where everyone bows to titles, the political speeches that dress corruption in patriotism, the Sunday sermons that shame you into silence. You're told these rituals are sacred, untouchable. But they are cages, designed to make you accept a world where you provide the labor, the loyalty, the sacrifice, while someone else drinks the wine. Clara's act was not just rebellion, it was revelation. She proved that the moment you interrupt the ritual, the moment you refuse to play your part, the system collapses. And that is exactly why her story was erased, because the powerful cannot afford for you to see the cracks in their ceremonies. Why blood? Why not poison in the stew or venom in the wine? Why blood in the chalice, blood in the mouth? Because Clara understood something ancient, something older than the plantations, older than Georgia, older than America itself. Blood is the deepest symbol of power. From the dawn of civilization, the ruling class has used blood as currency. In temples, priests slit the throats of animals, and sometimes people, to appease the gods. In Rome, gladiators spilled their blood for the entertainment of elites, a reminder that life and death belong to Caesar. Even the church, with its chalice of communion, teaches its followers to drink the blood as a ritual of obedience, binding them to the institution. Always blood. Always the same message. Your body belongs to us. Your life force feeds our order. The Harlans' supper was no different. Their table, their rituals, their hierarchy. It was a continuation of that ancient cycle. The family drank wine as a symbol of refinement, never realizing it was just a polished echo of something far more primal, the cycle of blood and dominance. Clara saw through it. She tore the mask off the ritual. She forced them to taste not a symbol, but the reality behind the symbol. Not grape, but flesh. Not tradition, but mortality. That is why the story was buried, because Clara's act didn't just kill a family. It exposed the secret behind every system of control. Blood is not sacred. It is not divine. It is not a covenant between man and God. It is survival. It is mortality. It is proof that even those who claim superiority bleed like anyone else. Understand this. The powerful survive by making their blood seem different from yours. They call it royal blood, noble blood, pure blood. They invent names, titles, genealogies, all to convince you that their veins carry something you do not. Clara shattered that lie. She reminded them, and by extension reminded, all of us, that their blood is just as red, just as fragile, just as mortal. So when she poured blood instead of wine, she was not just serving death. She was serving truth. And truth is far more dangerous than poison, because poison kills the body. But truth destroys illusions. And once an illusion collapses, the entire empire built on it begins to shake. Clara's erasure was not unique. It was part of a pattern, a war on memory. The powerful know that control is not maintained by chains alone. Chains rust, chains break. But when you erase a story, when you bury a truth, you chain the mind. And a chained mind will obey long after the iron is gone. Think of how many times history has been scrubbed clean for your consumption. Slave uprisings reduced to footnotes. Native resistance reframed as savagery. Secret societies whispered about, but never openly discussed. And in every case, the message is the same. Don't remember, don't question, don't imagine that the weak ever won. That's the kind of history they want you to inherit. A history that conditions obedience. Clara was a crack in that design. If her story had spread, if men across the South had heard that a girl with no power, no freedom, no weapon but knowledge could bring down an entire dynasty, it would have planted seeds of defiance everywhere. It would have awakened the realization that control is a performance, not a fact. That's why the church called it plague. That's why the state stamped it fever. That's why newspapers never printed a word. They weren't protecting the Harlans, they were protecting the system, and the system has not stopped. Even now you are fed a curated history, victories of the powerful, tragedies explained away, rebellions softened or erased. The same hand that crossed Clara's name from the ledger is still moving today, deciding what you are allowed to remember. That is why you were never taught this story in school. That is why the archives hide it in coded language. And that is why you feel, even now, like listening to this is dangerous. Because it is dangerous. Memory is power. Knowledge is rebellion. And the moment you begin to collect the forgotten stories, the erased truths, the suppressed names, you stop being controlled. You stop being obedient. You start becoming what Clara became the night she poured blood into crystal, a mirror held up to power, forcing it to see its own fragility. So ask yourself, how much of your memory is borrowed, scripted, manufactured by someone else? How many times have you believed the official story when the margins whispered another truth? And more importantly, how many more Claras are buried in the dust, waiting for you to dig them up? You may think Clara's world is distant, a southern mansion, candlelight, slavery, rituals of blood. But what if I told you the same machinery still operates today? The tools have changed, the architecture has evolved, but the psychology of control is identical. Look around. Do you not see rituals dressed in modern clothing? Boardrooms where men in suits gather around polished tables, reciting scripted phrases about growth and shareholder value. Parliaments and Congress, halls where officials perform debates, shaking fists at each other, while behind closed doors they toast from the same bottles. Churches where men in robes pass cups to trembling hands, conditioning obedience through repetition. All rituals, all tables, all staged. And where are you in these rituals? You work the hours, You pay the dues, you give your time, your energy, your faith. But like Clara in the kitchen, you are excluded from the feast itself. You are the hand behind the machine, never allowed to drink from the chalice. You are conditioned to believe this is normal, even sacred. And so, you obey. This is the psychology of control, to make you forget that you are the one holding everything together. To keep you blind to the fact that the rituals of the powerful collapse without your participation. They convince you their blood is different, their table eternal, their system unbreakable. But Clara proved otherwise. A single act of defiance can desecrate the ritual. A single interruption can reveal the illusion. Now pause for a moment. Imagine the rituals you've been trapped in. The job that drains you while others profit, the beliefs that shame you while others dominate, the traditions you follow without questioning why. These are not harmless customs, they are chains, polished and disguised as order. And until you see them for what they are, you will remain where Clara began, silenced, invisible, obedient. But once you see it, once you recognize the ritual for what it is, you cannot unsee it. And that is why this knowledge is dangerous, because dangerous knowledge awakens a man. Dangerous knowledge turns a servant into a strategist, a follower into a disruptor, an obedient body into a living weapon. Clara stepped into that role the night she poured blood into the goblet. The question is, will you step into yours? If you've stayed with me this far, you already sense it. This is not just a story about the past. This is an initiation. You were not meant to hear Clara's name, nor to imagine her hands pouring that chalice of blood. And yet, here you are, listening, remembering, seeing. That alone makes you different from the obedient masses. But difference is only the beginning. Awareness without action is still obedience. Clara did not merely notice the hypocrisy of her captors. She shattered their ritual. She replaced the symbol with the substance. And once she acted, the illusion of their untouchable power was destroyed forever. That is the role of the awakened, not to watch, not to whisper, but to interrupt the script. And so I ask you, what ritual in your own life must be interrupted? What table have you been kneeling beside, handing out plates, pouring the wine, without ever realizing you had the power to corrupt the feast? The Harlands had no idea that their destruction was already in the room with them, silent, unnoticed, waiting. That is the power you carry when you awaken. You become the unseen threat, the fracture in the ritual, the hidden knife. Now listen carefully. This is not entertainment. This is a test. If you are hearing this and feel nothing, you are still asleep. If you are hearing this and feel unease, you are beginning to wake. But if you are hearing this and feel the fire of defiance, then you are already stepping onto Clara's path. That fire must not be ignored, it must be named. So here is your challenge. If you are awake, declare it. In the comments, leave the words, "I see the blood." Nothing more. Those 4 words are a signal, a seal, a declaration that you no longer believe the rituals of the powerful, that you are not blind to their illusions, that you will not be erased as Clara was. The archives may never preserve her name. The state may never write her in the textbooks. But here, now, in this moment, you can carve her memory back into the world by declaring that you see the blood. Do this, and you are no longer a passive listener. You are part of the forbidden memory itself. The night of Clara's act did not simply kill a family. It sent shockwaves through the entire structure of Southern power. The Harlands were not just wealthy planters. They were pillars of influence, linked to judges, clergy, and governors. For them to fall so suddenly, so mysteriously, was not merely tragedy. It was a crack in the foundation. And cracks spread. The whispers began almost immediately, not among the poor, who already lived in silence, but among the elite themselves. At their polished tables, in their candle-lit parlors, men and women spoke in hushed voices about what had happened at the Harlan estate. Some swore it was illness, others suspected poisoning. A few dared to whisper the unthinkable, that the enslaved had found a way to turn ritual against ritual, that the blood had answered the blood. Fear took root, and fear reshapes everything. Suddenly, chalices of wine were no longer raised with confidence. The rituals lost their shine. Guests refused to drink unless they saw the bottle opened before them. Some families abandoned their sacred feasts altogether, claiming it was out of season. But everyone knew why. They were afraid. Afraid that what happened to the Harlans could happen to them. Do you see the significance? Clara had broken more than a ritual. She had pierced the psychological armor of the ruling class. For centuries, they had relied on symbols to project invincibility. To drink from the chalice was to display power, sanctity, permanence. But now the chalice was a symbol of death. Every sip was a reminder of their fragility. Every toast carried the taste of fear. That fear never made it into the history books. But it left fingerprints. Laws grew harsher. Punishments became more public, more brutal. Slave codes were rewritten with new urgency, designed to terrify the very people who had terrified them. Preachers thundered louder from pulpits about obedience, submission, and divine order. This is the reflex of power when it feels threatened. It doubles down, it smothers, it rewrites the rules to protect its image. But beneath it all, the elites could not shake the unease. In their private diaries, in coded letters sent between estates, you find a tremor, the recognition that their rituals were no longer unshakable, that maybe the order they worshipped was nothing more than performance, that maybe, just maybe, the blood at their tables was always waiting to betray them. Clara had vanished into silence, but her shadow lingered, and in that shadow the powerful stumbled. When elites taste fear, they do not surrender. They adapt. The Harlan collapse forced the plantation aristocracy to evolve their rituals into something more concealed, more coded. What had once been ostentatious displays of dominance now became shrouded performances, cloaked in secrecy. The chalice was no longer raised in public halls. It was hidden in locked chambers, behind velvet curtains, away from prying eyes. But secrecy breeds complexity. To protect themselves, the ruling class began embedding symbols within symbols. A toast might appear as nothing more than a gesture of hospitality. But the way the hand circled the goblet, the precise order of who drank first, the phrasing of the blessing before the sip, all became coded signs. Outsiders saw wine. Insiders saw hierarchy. Outsiders heard prayer. Insiders heard command. This was the beginning of what some historians whisper about as the Southern Codes. Invisible systems of ritual that governed trust and loyalty within elite circles. They could no longer rely on their wealth alone. They needed signs, countersigns, private passwords hidden in gestures and rites. Those who knew the codes were considered safe. Those who didn't were suspect. And here's the irony. Clara's act, meant to destroy them, had forced them to grow sharper, more deceptive, more serpentine. Fear sharpened their cunning. Her defiance had burned the old veil of invincibility, but in response, they wove a new one more intricate, one that hid its face behind layers of civility. That's how power survives. It never admits defeat. It mutates, but pay attention, because this is the same pattern you see today. When one illusion collapses, the system builds another. When a scandal erupts, new narratives appear to cover it. When corruption is exposed, new laws are written that look like reforms, but actually tighten control. Clara's shadow still lingers, not just in the South of 1830, but in the very architecture of power you live under right now. And here lies the chilling truth. Every time an illusion is broken, a darker, more concealed ritual emerges. Every time blood spills, the system absorbs it and becomes more ruthless. Clara exposed their fragility, yes, but in doing so, she also provoked the birth of something far more dangerous, an elite order that learned to hide its rituals, not in chalices of blood, but in plain sight, disguised as tradition, law, and progress. And once the codes were born, there was no turning back. Once the codes took root, a terrifying shift occurred. Control was no longer enforced only with whips and chains, but with psychology. This was the real genius of the Southern elites. They understood that fear is loud, but suggestion is eternal. A lash breaks the body, but a code, invisible and unspoken, bends the mind. The new rituals were not meant for slaves alone. They were designed for everyone: the overseers, the household staff, the poor whites, even the elite themselves. Each person lived inside a maze of signals they barely understood, always uncertain of what was permitted, what was dangerous, what was sacred. A bowed head, a delayed response, a misplaced hand at the table. These could mark someone as disloyal, as an outsider, as a threat. Imagine living in such a system. Nothing is written down, nothing is said aloud. You just know, or you don't. And if you don't, you vanish. This is not discipline through punishment. This is discipline through paranoia. Everyone polices themselves because no one is sure where the boundaries lie. That is how control becomes permanent, when people begin to enforce it on themselves without needing the lash at all. And this, my friend, is the true legacy of Clara's act. She had shown them their fragility, and in response, they perfected invisibility. Her defiance forced them to invent a system that could not be destroyed by any single act of rebellion. Because how do you poison a ritual that has no visible cup? How do you shatter a code when the code is silence itself? Do you recognize this pattern today? Look at your own world. Rules are rarely written as law. They are written as expectation, as politeness, as normal. Cross them, and you will not be whipped. You will be erased, fired, banished, cancelled, forgotten. This is not new. It is the same machine, refined, digitized, globalized. The Southern Codes were just one chapter in a much longer book. A book that is still being written on your skin, in your speech, in your silence. Clara had struck a blow, yes, but the blow had awakened something more insidious. The realization that the best chains are invisible, and the best prisons are built inside the mind. Invisible control cannot survive without reminders. And so, the Southern elites perfected the art of selective terror. They did not need to punish everyone. They only needed to choose one every so often and make the punishment unforgettable. When an enslaved person was accused of breaking a code, speaking too boldly, looking too long at a master, moving in ways that suggested defiance, the punishment was no longer simply for them. It became theater. The chosen victim was dragged into the courtyard, the fields, or the town square, and what followed was designed to burn itself into memory. A hanging, a branding, a mutilation. Not every day, not everywhere, just enough. This was deliberate. If terror is constant, it dulls. But if terror is occasional, unpredictable, and spectacular, it burns deep into the psyche. The masses began to live not in the certainty of pain, but in the uncertainty of when pain would strike. And uncertainty is the most effective leash. You never knew if you were safe. You never knew if today would be the day you became the example. But it was. Not only the enslaved who were disciplined this way, overseers who failed in loyalty, servants who whispered too much, even members of elite families who disobeyed the inner codes could find themselves destroyed in subtle but decisive ways. a ruined reputation, a mysterious disappearance, an inheritance revoked. Punishment was not always physical. Sometimes it was social death, which in that world was worse than execution. The lesson was clear. No one was untouchable. Power maintained itself not by endless violence, but by strategic violence. And this is the true horror. The elites learned to make the spectacle of a single punishment ripple across hundreds of minds. Clara's defiance had forced them to become more precise, more calculating. Where once the chalice ruled by symbolism, now the lash and the rope ruled by performance. And here is the chilling echo across centuries. This principle is alive today. You do not need to see millions punished to obey. You only need to see a few. Those who lost careers for speaking truths, those who vanished after exposing corruption, those who were paraded as examples. One spectacle is enough to silence thousands. Selective terror is the skeleton key of power, and once learned, it never dies. Clara had disrupted their rituals, yes, but in the ashes, the elites built a system, far more efficient, and for those trapped beneath it, survival meant learning to read the codes, or risk becoming the next public warning. Where there are codes, there are always those who learn to read them. And while the elites perfected their selective terror, something else began to stir beneath the surface. Networks of resistance. Not open rebellion, not the kind that could be crushed with fire and rope, but hidden counter-systems, whispered in the dark, passed like secret scripture. Enslaved men and women began to study the elites as closely as the elites studied them. Every gesture, every ritual, every pause in speech was noted, memorized, deciphered. If the ruling class moved like serpents, the oppressed became hunters of serpents. Songs sung in the fields carried double meanings. One melody for the overseer's ears, another message entirely for those who knew the hidden tongue. Prayers spoken in hushed tones were not always to the master's God. They were encoded maps, signals of escape, invocations of vengeance. Even the chalice, the cursed symbol of the Harlan family, was not forgotten. Stories of Clara's act spread quietly, carried on whispers, reshaped into legend. In the telling, she became more than a woman. She became a warning and a weapon. Mothers told their children of her defiance as if she were a saint. Men invoked her name in coded blessings before they plotted flight or sabotage. What the elites tried to bury became fuel for a hidden fire. And here is where the true danger began. Resistance was no longer just rebellion of the body, it became rebellion of the mind. A field hand who looked submissive might be carrying in his head an entire network of signals and strategies. A servant who bowed at table might be memorizing the codes to one day use them against their masters. The plantation became a stage, yes, but there were two plays being performed at once, one above ground, one below. The elites never understood the depth of this countercurrent. They thought they had concealed their rituals, but in truth, they had taught the oppressed the value of concealment. Clara's defiance had not only transformed the ruling class, it had planted the seed of secret resistance, resistance that could wait, adapt, and strike when the time was right. And the most chilling truth of all, those counter-systems never died. They evolved, just as power evolved. In every society where codes of domination rise, codes of resistance rise alongside them. Hidden languages, unseen alliances, unspoken vows. Power breeds its own shadow. And in that shadow, Clara's ghost walked still,